to the Quiet Warrior Show, where we help top leaders find their pathway to incredible success and a lifetime of happiness. Here is your host, Tom Dutta, the Quiet Warrior.
Well, welcome to the Quiet Warrior Show. My name is Tom Dutta. I am the Quiet Warrior, and I'm excited to have on the line today Vindy Teja. Hey, Vindy, welcome to the show.
Oh, great to be here, Tom.
Yeah, what a great thing to be doing during a pandemic. talking in social or self or whatever they call that, isolating.
Yes, that's right. Perfect combination.
Yeah. Well, listen, before we get going, because this show is all about you, I wanted to just tell the audience how I met you. It's a great story from my perspective that I did my first TED Talk in February 29th, 2020, which was not long ago. And there's this woman in the green room, and she was wearing a backpack and had a water bottle and said, "It's your time to go." And she walked me up these stairs and all my nerves and everything was pouring out. And this person just seemed really calm and collected. I'm going like, "Have you been here before?" And well, it was you. So you'll always be a part of that journey in that way. And inspiring. And so let's really turn it to you. Tell us quickly about yourself. I have your bio. I'll build you up a bit more after that.
Sure. Yes. Thank you. And yes, that TEDx experience was really quite something. And it was great to meet you there and form this connection. So a little bit about myself. I am a native of Vancouver. I was born and raised, and I went to school both here and in Ontario, and I went to law school. And after articling and being called to the bar, I shifted because I moved jurisdictions, and I sort of discovered coaching before it was even called coaching, and it was with law students and lawyers, and that's kind of where that passion was born. And eventually I came back to BC, and then it's a long, convoluted, and somewhat interesting story, but the Coles Notes version is I went through kind of a really big, awful divorce, and then I had this real experience of, okay, what do I have to offer? And then I got into divorce coaching, of all things. I didn't know that even existed, but I was doing so much of it, I decided to go pro. And so that's what I do. And then I, along the way, did a TED Talk that was sort of connected as well. And then I authored a book, and yeah, it's been a really neat journey.
Awesome. Well, that's great. Well, obviously lots of wisdom there. Everybody, I'm going to build Vindy up a bit. I mentioned to you that the guests that come on my show, Vindy, I asked them to check their ego at the door, and well, you certainly don't have one, but I want to say a little bit more about you. And you have in your long bio this terminology, no stranger to hacking her way back to happiness. I just love that. A proud single parent, as I mentioned, a TEDx speaker. Everybody check out Vindy's TEDx, Bear Creek Park Talk, professional life and divorce coach, author. The author piece, we'll get to the book because there's an interesting title to that book. We'll talk about that through the story. And I'm just fascinated with the journey you've taken, and particularly this innovative thing called divorce coaching, life coaching, and personal training all together. And I have some lived experience with part of that. And so let's really get into the story. I mean, as I began to think about this in my mind, I'm thinking, what am I going to talk about with you when you come on? And as you know, my show is a bit of a freak flag. It's not vanilla. So I'm thinking like, well, I watch a TED Talk. All right, we can talk about that. But first, take us into the backstory, where it all began, your journey. I know you mentioned to me offline that you were born here and had roots to another country, but start wherever you want and just take us to the point of that divorce, and then I'll take it back from you there.
Sure. Well, I met my ex-husband in university, and we all hung out with the same group of friends. And, we went through school together. We were students for a long time because we went to professional school. So we moved around the country. So we were together for a long time. And eventually we did move back to BC to start our family. And then, and I talk about this in my TED Talk, one day I was just kind of blindsided, and it was over. And it was like, huh, what? And so I kind of, after curling up in the fetal position for a little while, I was like, what's going on here? And so it was a really big blow. And I'm a positive person and I'm in the coaching field. And my attitude is usually, okay, so what can I learn from this? And I tend to bounce back. Pretty quickly. I consider myself a really resilient person, but this one really knocked me out. And I had had some other, hardships. Like I had lost my father prematurely, and I had gone through, issues with, having my daughter. And so, it's not like I hadn't dealt with anything, but this one was really knocked me out. And so I really had to work hard at figuring out how to, what I call getting back to my happy. And so it was quite a journey. And so people started approaching me and they started asking me for advice about divorce. And it was quite unexpected, but I think it's also because I had a legal background, and then people perceived that I had gone through mine fairly well. And so I started fielding all these questions. And then I realized, wow, there's a gap here. People are needing something like this because, going straight to a lawyer can be very expensive and time consuming. And so I identified this sort of gap. And that's when I got into the divorce coaching and did a certification. And it's been kind of really neat since then.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for sharing that. I mean, coming on to an interview and being vulnerable for some people is difficult. I'm honored and proud of your story because you share it. Sorry for the loss of your father. Sometimes when we're talking, my brain's going in a different direction. I lost my dad in January 18, and one of the things I didn't do very well is stay connected to him because of my early years, and had some regrets when he passed, even though I had seen him a few months before. And so I'm glad that you had at least this father relationship in your life. I was watching the TED Talk and it said big 10 years, and I can't remember the exact words, but he wanted out or something like that. And then I wrote down on my paper here, big awful divorce. So I'm gonna relate to that a little bit because I think we want to use this as teaching moment on the show before we get into the rest of the story. That I'll just tell you that I've been through divorce myself. And I think I was roughly 30 years old when that happened. And I won't get into all the backstory. I wrote about it in my book in a sort of a fable ways to respect my ex. But I remember coming through it, and you're a coach. So one of the questions I asked myself was, where were your fingerprints on this? I remember for the first while after, it was all blaming about the situation that I didn't like in the relationship, and there was some issues with the culture and all that. But then as I grew up and started doing my own self-work, I realized there were some ways I contributed to that. And so just, if you can, tell us about, 10 years is 10 years. It's a long time, but, where do you see that went wrong? What were your fingerprints on that, if any, and what did you learn from it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that when something big like that happens, then people do blame, but it's good to self-reflect. And I think even as a woman, I think I find with a lot of my female friends, when something goes wrong, the first thing sometimes women will do is be like, what did I do wrong? Where did I? And so, and I don't know if it's a female male thing or if it's just a human thing, but I definitely did a ton of self-reflection and looked at myself and where could I have been different, or how was I impacted by what was going on around me, like culturally, some of our gender roles, career, looking at all sorts of things and saying, okay, where was my piece in this? And so I did go through that journey. And I mean, depending on the day you ask me, Tom, it'll be a different answer, quite honestly, because I'll look at certain things. I'll be like, oh, I'm a rock star in those areas. And other times I'll look at some of my habits and I'll be like, oh, I wish that was a bit different. Or how come I can't, rid myself of that habit? And so, it's an interesting interplay. Like I will change my mind based on kind of, the day, the mood, the stage of life I'm in. And I've gotten, I think, a little bit more chill about the whole thing. And I think that's time probably, but also my work. So I see so much of this and I see patterns emerging for people, and they go through this really emotional period where it's like a fire hose that's going off, right? Like everything's changing. It's like financial, it's family, it's your relationship with your ex, and then you're having to deal with parenting issues. So it's just so overwhelming. But then when you kind of bring it down and you start getting some action steps and you start getting some control, then all of a sudden those things that seemed really big are not as big anymore because you have a bit more control.
No, absolutely. And you said you had you're a single parent, so you have a daughter. How old was she when you went through that?
She was just shy of 2.5, so quite young.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she's a teenager now, and 16 going on 22.
No, absolutely. Well, I'll come back to that. Another question that popped in my mind about what you said about depending on the day. So just park that.
Mhm.
As a son of parents who were born in, my parents were born and raised in Fiji, with roots to India. That's where my grandparents are from, and I think people will know by your name that you have an ethnic background that might be India. And you confirmed that with me that northern India, I think, is where your parents were from. There's this cultural stuff about arranged marriages too, which I, as an immigrant to this country, I have my own view on it. Was your marriage arranged, or were your parents very much modern thinking, where you could find your own life partner?
That's a really good question. My marriage was not arranged, and it could well have been arranged, or at least an arranged introduction to someone that my parents, thought was suitable. But it was one of those goals I had. I think early on in my life that if at all possible, I'm going to avoid an arranged marriage. I think that was on my list of goals because, and yeah, so mine was not. It was still. I still had cultural and constraints about who I could marry, and a lot of it was implied. It wasn't really talked about, and there were some rules I was willing to break, and other rules I was very much a goody two shoes, and kind of followed the party line.
Give us an
Uh,
example of a cultural constraint. Not all the listeners, have
oh,
that
sure,
background.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I didn't grow up religious, but I think the expectation was that I would marry somebody Sikh. That's what my background is, and that I wouldn't go outside my culture. If I married non-Sikh, but I don't even think that was sort of. I just assumed, oh, I have to marry somebody Sikh, and
Yeah.
back then it was considered a big deal. Now I think there's a lot more freedom, and that's not a constraint that I would ever put on my daughter at all, but back then it was the norm. And so I think I wanted to play within the limit, which was you can find somebody, but make sure he checks off these boxes.
So can we assume that your previous partner was Sikh, or?
Correct, yeah, yeah,
uh,
he was Sikh.
and then I we were talking before we got on the line, because I'm fascinated about people who have long distance relationships. I had that for a period of time with my first wife. When you really look at everything, what was the main factor in your mind that led to this, or what when he said he wants that? What was the main factor that you was there? What was it, if you can share?
Yeah, I mean it's a tricky situation, and out of respect, I there's only a certain amount that I do share, just because it's complicated. I mean, sometimes I joke about it, like when you go to the hair salon and and everybody's telling stories about their lives, and you're like, wow, it's like a drama. And so I went to the hairdresser, and this was after the separation, and so my hairdresser asked me, he's like, so how are you doing? I'm like, oh boy, do I have a story to tell you. And so I was, for once, the person who had the story to tell, and it was really strange for me because I never saw myself that way. But it was kind of very kind of, I call it a cross between a Twilight Zone and a Jerry Springer episode. And so I kind of leave it at that. And so I think that was definitely a factor. Is that it was a complicated situation. But I think also changing priorities. I think sometimes people realize they want something different and they're not able to articulate it, or there's other factors that might kind of, influence their decision. And so if you don't talk about these kind of things, or they're not open and brought to the surface, they can just damage a relationship. I mean, I felt like we had a very kind of communicative relationship because we went to university together, and all told we were together for 15 years. So it was not a small period of time. But sometimes you just don't know. Like, you don't know yourself well enough. You don't know the other person well enough. And I think that was a lot of my journey was, oh, I thought I had things figured out about life and people, and that this process really made me question a lot of that stuff and go back to the basics, because maybe something there was not working. So I had to examine it a bit more, which I did.
Yeah,
If
no,
that makes sense.
yeah, it does. Thank you. I just want to talk a bit more about my situation in parallel. Then we'll get into this thing called hacking your way to happiness, which is fascinating to me. Uh, my so the woman that I'm married to now, Anna, she's amazing. We've 24 years, but we both came out of a divorce, and one of the painful parts of that was navigating. She had 2 children, I didn't have any, but navigating through that. And mine was more amicable, but hers was, the fellow she was married to, it was a difficult one because he had some serious behavioral issues, and and I saw the kids suffer. They're 9 and 12, and I know that at an early age of 2, 2.5, the prefrontal cortex part of the brain's not developed, so they really can't rationalize or think about thoughts. It's almost a good time to, if anything, to go through this. But my wife's kids were 9, 12, going into that point where they're starting to think about things. And it was an interesting and difficult experience, I thought. But I just want to go back to me then to bare my soul a bit, that I got past that point of myself, and I honor you for your respect. But I've written about this, and I talk openly about it. I got to a point where Dr. Hartman, who's a psychologist and I teaches personality science, became a friend of mine 15 years ago. And he said something in a classroom when he was certifying me to teach his science. He said, own you. He said, you can't change the other person. He said, you own yourself. And he said, don't put it on me or on them. And what I really discovered about my first marriage and is that when I went into that marriage, it was a cultural difference. I can say that her parents were from mainland China. It was outside of my culture. My parents were like yours. They're wonderful and didn't impose that on us. And when you said that you weren't told to be in a same culture marriage, I went, yes, finally somebody who's speaking that truth. Because a lot of Indians that I have on my show, they're all part of this, clan of it's got to be an arranged marriage. But I went into this marriage and they didn't like me, and there was cultural differences and all this stuff. And then there was this other stuff going on between my ex and a member of the family. And when I left it, I was always pointing the finger. But what I realized is from my own lifeline that I was going into relationships because I wasn't happy. There was a hole in my soul. And I've written about this in my book. And I thought when I meet people, if I make them happier, well, they're going to, then I'm going to be happier. Then the second time I got married, Vindy, it was really more about, I was going into that fulfilled and happy. So I wasn't relying on the other person to fill that void. So I just wanted to share that with you because I really appreciate the work that you're doing as a divorce life coach, but also even you talked about in your TED Talk, things like prenup agreements. I think if we had that through the circumstances we went through last, it would have made things a lot better.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you for sharing that. And I think you raised some really important points uh, about being a whole person when you go into a relationship. And I think that sometimes when you're young, you're still becoming a person. I mean, I'm still becoming a person, and I'm in my 40s, and I'm always interested to see who I'm going to be, next year and what I'm going to be doing. But when you're young, you're very impressionable, and there's a lot of stuff you're still figuring out. And when you figure that out in a relationship, you grow together. It can be really magical and beautiful, but you also change. And I think that, and sometimes you rely on a person for your identity or vice versa. And as you mature, you figure out, well, be your own person. And I'm very much an advocate of that. And, it's something I talk about with my daughter, even though she's, just a teenager. We have a lot of open conversations about these kind of things because I want to pass on some of that wisdom that I gained through the experience to her, and hopefully, give her the confidence to make the decisions that are gonna work for her life.
Yeah, you're such a mentor. I love that. I love your story and you and all this because it's so inspiring. I think, anyone out there would want to have a mother like you. I we talked about the hairdresser. It's kind of funny now because they're all closed, so we all need a therapist, I guess. I don't know where to go to talk. That's why I'm doing so many podcasts. But I remember, well, I can tell you that the lady who did my eyebrows and coloring and all that stuff for my TED talk, she she's from an Indian family, and the story's similar. The things I hear, that these traditional values. One of the things, I don't know if you know, there's a woman named Kamal Dillon out there who's written a book called The Black and Blue Sari. And you can tell by the title where I'm going, but in the Indian culture, there's also a lot of, and I'm not tarring all Indian men, but there's a lot of controlling and abuse, and it's covered up. And I'm an advocate for abused children and children who come from that because I was one. But the thing about it is that in this country, you come here, if you're an Indian man, or it doesn't matter what culture, you have to adapt and fit in. And one of the things I like to say is, fitting in without stepping up. Sorry, fitting in without selling out is stepping up. And so here we are, and I've got friends who are married to some of these most controlling men from that culture, and they don't change, and they can't have their own life. And I have men I know in business in the community. I respect them all. I love the businesses they have, but they have this thing like, I got to find my daughters, their husbands. And I'm going like, no, you don't. Let them decide for themselves. Who tells you and who gives you the right to tell them who they should marry? Because if I know enough about, a good and a bad person, let your daughters decide. So I just
Right.
went on a tangent. I want to honor you for that because I think that's the next generation. And, I would have loved to have met your father because I would have that same conversation with anyone.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Most definitely. I think I was lucky in the sense that I was brought up in a half traditional family. Like, my dad was a big believer in sports and education
Yeah.
for all his kids. And so he, didn't hold me back when a lot of my Indian peers were not able to do those things. So I think that really gave me a lot of confidence and direction in my life. So I was very lucky. I was friends with my dad, and he was my biggest advocate. So, but then there was that traditional side of him as well, and that was like, cultural. And I had to navigate that just like my friends did, and my family, and, other female cousins. So it's tricky, and there's a lot to learn, but I do see a lot of change in the newer generation, which is great.
Yeah, that was one of my questions on my paper, is that do you see marriage or the institution of marriage changing with the generations?
That's a fascinating question, and I don't know the answer to that because, certainly in wider society, marriage is becoming an option instead of mandatory, and there's lots of good reasons for that. And even in the Indian culture, I do see a lot of people waiting. I see a lot of people sort of dating and being in different relationships when that was considered a taboo before if you were in more than one relationship. And the idea is that you find the right partner, not just the first partner. So that I think those are positive changes. I think there's still a big push towards marriage and family. So I don't know how that's going to work, but I mean, at least when I talk to my daughter, she's like, "Well, I don't know. Maybe I think I'd like to have a family." And so it's
Yeah.
interesting to see her point of view.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think you touched on a nerve there with me. It's interesting because I've done a lot of, well, it's mostly my own development, and then I started teaching brain science. And I know you know a lot of this, but I just wanted, for a teaching moment on the show, talk about it, that in the first 10 or 15 years, we don't have that ability to separate from our thoughts, think about them, to see if they're true or not. Everything we hear is true, and it goes and embeds in the neural nets in our brains. So I have this philosophy that children, let's take your daughter, for example, 2.5, or any child in that age group up to maybe 10 or 12 or 13, they hear the word, or they understand the word marriage or partnership or mom dad, and they draw thoughts around that. That's, the brain produces thoughts. That's all it does. So if you grew up like I did, my parents divorced, my dad was pretty bad alcoholic at the time, but everything I knew I had wired in my brain about love and mom and dad was what I saw: violence and alcoholism and all this. My father had some affairs, and I loved my dad. I mean, I made peace and understood his background was coming from a traditional Indian culture that was violent. His dad was an alcoholic, so he brought those rules into parenting, and it wasn't his fault. But the point is that I grew up, and when I realized this, my brain had things wired in it unconsciously that feared relationships, feared difficult people. And Tony Robbins likes to say that, one of my mentors, that who do you block and who do you attract? And Anna and I like to joke in our relationship, and it's part of this science I talk about, that personality science. Our relationship's referred to as blood, sweat, and tears. So
Right.
I think in 24 years, maybe 2-3 times, we both didn't know if we would make the journey. And what I realized through that was I was blocking sometimes my wife, and she's wonderful. We talk about this because she's assertive, she's strong, she's an Italian woman, she's amazing, but she had characteristics that I feared because she appeared sometimes to be my father. Yet other men wouldn't see her that way. And what I realized, it wasn't about her, it was about me blocking her because of my wiring. So
Right.
I like to look at all this. I see my daughter and I have 2 stepsons, they're older and married, but they all waited. And when we talked to them, or when I heard them talk about it, they said, well, they're uncertain and they're waiting because they came to that same mind map of marriage isn't good, or marriage is going to end up in pain. And they're testing the waters and navigating that. So that's my little rant for the next generation. I say take your time, and you know what? As long as you're happy, do what makes sense. So I want to
Mhm.
shift gears to this. Give us a few nuggets about hacking your way back to happiness. I just love that. You wrote a book called YOLO.
Yes, I wrote a book called YOLO: Essential Life Hacks for Happiness, and it was kind of it was at the end of this whole journey, and I had done a lot of work on myself, and then I was a coach, and I was a parent, and I saw a lot of friends struggling with very similar issues, both married and non-married, divorced and not divorced. That I thought, oh, okay, this is like an important area, and so I really wanted to delve into the topic of happiness, and that's what motivated me to write the book. There were a few other motivations as well, and the philosophy behind the book is like it's my strong belief that you know what doesn't kill you makes you not only stronger, but it makes you funnier too. And that happiness is not a restricted club, and I highlight the hacks that I use to find my way back to happiness after divorce. And it's based on there's a coaching paradigm behind it as well, and it's kind of the idea that you know happiness is it doesn't mean you're avoiding problems or challenges or setbacks or insecurities. That happens, but it's about knowing how to approach these situations and being intentional about your life and what it has to offer. And so I offer these building blocks, and it's like a puzzle. So once you put the puzzle together, it's like the overall happiness puzzle. That's the way I see it.
Yeah, can you? I don't know if you can recall or just recount a couple. Is there any you can just, or even one you can just share?
Absolutely. One of my favorite ones is QTip, which I don't remember where I heard it, but it's something that I tell people to keep in mind, and it's an acronym that stands for quit taking it personally.
Mm,
And
interesting.
and that's one of my favorite ones, because I think that once you sort of get that one, it changes everything. That what people do is, or say or think, it's not because of you, it's because of their sort of wiring, like what you were talking about, your wiring growing up, and what your concept of marriage was and how embedded it was. And it's based on kind of their experience in life, their knowledge, their experiences, and it's not a reflection of who you are. And so I think have better relationships and more confidence when you get that tip under your belt.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you clarified that. I had this vision of a Q-tip going in my ear there, and I am visual in a weird way. But what a great tip! And I was thinking one of my passions too is mental health, as you know, and this thing about happiness. It's so it's so underrated. The fact is that if we could do what you said and find nourishing activities, or the self appreciation, whatever it is, pat yourself on the back. Good for me to feel we're enough. And I don't know what you think about this as you're raising your daughter, but there's a lot of there's a lot of children that are coming up into the world that don't feel they're enough. They're not happy. And some of it is because all they heard throughout their growing was, don't do this, don't do that. Standards are really high. And how about we say this, just say to our children, you know what, you're enough and I love you just the way you are. It doesn't matter who you marry, what you do, what degree you have. You're perfect. You're born golden. I mean, how do you feel about that?
Absolutely. I think that that is a cornerstone of great parenting. And we have to model that behavior for our children, because if we're saying that to them, but yet we're constantly holding ourselves to these other standards of keeping up with the Joneses or doing this and doing that, they're not going to believe us. And I think it starts again with self, that if we can kind of model that behavior and then pass it on to our kids, they will hopefully be able to carry it forward in their lives. And so I do agree with you that, it's great to have ambitions and motivation and goals and interests, but the, the core is you are enough and I love you. And that's what
Yeah.
I believe as a parent.
Oh, that's awesome. However you develop that as a parent, way to go. I love that. The thing that I learned recently through a program I was sent to called cognitive behavioral therapy. I have a concussion. I'm working through some mental health issues, but I'll just make this quick that they're saying now the people teaching it were psychiatrists and doctors, that the whole shift in changing of parenting has to happen because many of us were raised being given criticism that was personalized. And now they're saying you need to separate the person from the behavior. In other words, hey, Vindy, I love you, but what you just did there, I don't really like that too much. So that's a really cool way of shifting the paradigm, I think. And congratulations for the things you're doing, raising your amazing daughter.
Thank you.
I guess the last thing I want to just talk to you about before we wrap up here is your TED Talk was interesting, talking about prenuptials, and it was a very fascinating topic, and quite frankly, shift in thinking. I'm thinking like, what? I'm getting married and I got to think about that? And then I thought about what happened in my lifeline through one divorce and going through marrying somebody that, and then my parents, I forgot about the connection there. You know what? Maybe that would have been a good idea. Let me ask you this question about, I think you called it post-nup or prenup. I used to think because of Hollywood, right, that the only people who need prenups are those coming in with big assets, independent wealth. Uh, Let me just, how I put the question is, when you come into a marriage to have a prenup, post-nup marriage agreement, whatever that means, what's the easiest way to start that conversation with somebody?
A bottle of wine.
All right.
I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
I will sign anybody knows me. I'll sign anything over a bottle of wine. I mean, that's dangerous. But no, seriously, you're an expert on this, obviously, because you teach it and you're in the legal side. How would you, seriously, how would you do that?
Yeah, it's still a taboo subject with a lot of people. I mean, I'm encouraged by the fact that a lot of younger people are a lot savvier and they're a lot more matter of fact about these things, because they're realistic that even though they don't intend to separate or intend to divorce, they're aware of the stats. They're aware of the statistics. So they know that they might end up in that group, and they're responsible about how they organize their assets and the conversations they have. But for people who've grown up a little bit more traditional, it's still difficult to broach that subject. And so I really kind of coach people on sort of thinking about it differently, because it's a mindset. That's the first thing that you're working with. And, if you can be transparent and compassionate when you have this conversation with your partner, it's going to set you up well for your marriage, because let's face it, you have to have a lot of difficult conversations in your marriage. And if you can't have those conversations in the beginning about things like money and, emotions, then, you might not be able to have them later. So that's kind of the first sort of way I approach it is, or you could have other reasons, like you might have children from a previous marriage. and you want to protect them financially before remarrying. So that comes up as the topic of conversation. Or say you have a friend who's been through a difficult divorce and was told by their lawyers that, prenups would have saved a huge amount of headache and money. So then you share that concern with your partner. This is what my friends are telling me. This is what, or maybe you have like a parent or a grandparent that is concerned about, protecting a property or a family business or an inheritance. And so you talk about that. You say, okay, this is what my family is concerned about. And, I want to be open with you. There's a lot of different scenarios. I mean, you could have gotten married later in life, and what I say, Cupid arrived later in your life, and then you have careers and assets that you're concerned about. So I think if you just are really transparent and open about what the issues are and about what your concerns are, that sets you up nicely to at least start the conversation, and then you can have coaches like me coach you through it.
Awesome. What there's a range of costs for something like that, and just curious what that might look like, or is it due to complexity of the asset, the situation? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head there. But I mean, a standard prenup will probably cost about as much as, a decent engagement ring, not one that breaks the bank, but, but probably a couple of grand. But if your assets are really complicated and you've got family businesses and lots of complicated assets, it will be maybe a little bit more complex. And then you'd have to consult, a lawyer for that kind of advice. But, your standard agreement is not going to be that much if you consider it as insurance. Like that's how much you would pay for an insurance policy.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I assume that when I'm fascinated by this, that's why I'm asking another question. I assume that when things don't work out, what does the individual do? Bring that document as part of their when they consult you? Do they bring that with them, and you use that in the work you do?
That's a good question. I have faced that situation. I do have a client who has a prenup and then wasn't sure if it was going to stand up in court if she had to use it. But then there were circumstances around the signing of it that maybe made it invalid. So, there are tricky issues with prenups. But I think, a lot of the times if you've agreed on something, then it's just a matter of honoring it when the agreement,
Yeah.
when the
Yeah.
marriage, but then often people will fight it if it's not in their interest. If the prenup is not in their interest, they'll try to challenge the agreement legally as not being valid or binding, and that's when it sort of gets complicated. But so there's different issues depending on kind of how simple and basic it is, and what the issues are. Is it assets? Is it kids? Because it's different for each person.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, in reflection, looking even at my parents, although it was a different time, having some type of agreement would have saved. I mean, to cut to the chase, I love my mom, but after everything, and I was in my teens and literally attended all the meetings with the divorce lawyers for her, and she really was the one who wasn't working. What was left paid the legal bills, and if her and my dad didn't argue and fight so much through other resources, she would have probably had more. So
Hmm.
I think that's a really good. Everybody, you need to really consider this thought. Watch Vindy's TED Talk, because I think it's a compelling enough reason to go, how can this help with you know my marriage? And I was thinking, Vindy, I'll throw this at you, which is just the way it came out in my head a minute ago. About if I was signing one of those things, I would want to see something in it called a life plan and a predetermined agreement that if the marriage starts going sideways, we both agree to do certain things, maybe counseling, couples counseling, individual counseling, or maybe,
Right.
and I remember when I do coaching of executives, that we had this talk one day with a group about standards and expectations. This can apply to even, I guess, sports teams. We have children who don't come to practice on time and things. Well, an expectation in my marriage might be, I want you to respect me, not to demean me, talk down to me, or I want you to, equally share, do things together, and have some independence. That's an expectation, but then if you attach a standard to it, what happens if you disrespect me? And then we both can agree on it. That would be kind of a cool thing to put as an addendum into any kind of an agreement. And almost like it's a roadmap if things start going off track to get back on track. At least then you can go to your lawyer and say, well, we know we tried. We had those things there. But who knows
Right.
whether that ever sticks or not. Maybe I'll create my own one day.
No, I think you made a really good point, Tom. I do think that people have that conversation and they put terms, and whether they're strictly enforceable or not is a totally different issue. But the point is, you have the conversation and you actually the um, flesh out all the nuances of, oh, okay, what happens if. A lot of people don't have these
I know.
conversations,
I
and then
know.
when they fall into that situation, then what you were referring to earlier, some of that old family upbringing and assumptions and wiring comes out. And then you're like, well, I thought you thought this way. But then you just never had the conversation with the person. So I actually think that a prenup is such a great planning tool for people, not just with their finances, and their children, but with, how they're going to deal with conflict and how they're going to organize their lives. I think it's fantastic if you can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, just from experiences I've been through, I mean, to me, it's all about the kids too. And my daughter's 22 and university back east in New Brunswick, but not that I'm contemplating a divorce anytime soon. But to me, it's all about the kids, right? And I remember when I went through my situation with my parents, I don't even remember, but there was so much arguing over money. And I won't get into blaming, but I think a man, when he leaves a relationship, if he's a breadwinner, there should be an expectation that under the laws, you provide. And so many stories I hear of people leaving relationships and not providing and holding back and not, giving to support their children. I think it sucks. And quite frankly, it's disgusting. I could never do that as a parent. Having that conversation, even going into marriage, I'm open for that. Like, hey, if
Mm.
anything ever happened, you know what, and we have children, this is what I want to do, right? I want to commit.
Right,
But
right.
anyway,
And yeah, no, I think those are all valid points. And I don't think anybody think it's going to be that, they don't think it's going to be that, they're going to be in that situation.
yeah.
And that's what, and so then they don't go down that road. And everybody thinks they're going to behave well and be on their A game when they're divorcing. But then a lot of ugliness comes out. And so it's surprising. It's surprising what you see. And then those promises aren't upheld. So an agreement is a good way to honor those promises that you made when you were in a calm and loving mood towards each other.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. This conversation's gone so good into so many areas. I'm hoping people listening back to there's so many teaching moments, everybody, that Vindy's given us in these conversations. And I think one of the things I admire, Vindy, is that you've got lived experience going through this. So you're credible, you're relatable, and you're providing this, hacking your way back to happiness. You've taken that journey. So thank you for all of that. As we wrap up here, I want to honor you with a few words. I write these down on my paper. I call them leadership words. They're not scripted. They come to me as we're talking. And the first one is wisdom. I mean, just have so much of it because of what your story is. Number two is love. It comes out of you just the way you talk and you care about humanity and people have gone through this. Your daughter, your father, your late father. Three is guide. You're a guide for those who maybe haven't taken that journey or perhaps are struggling through it. And the last one is author. You're an authority with your TED Talk and the book, authority on so many great things. So I want you to tell us about how people can get a hold of you and your body of work.
Thanks, Tom. I'm glowing now after all those things that you said. I just want to kind of hold that moment for a second.
it's it's not it's you don't have the wine cracked open, I'm sure.
No, that's hilarious. Well, people can find me on the World Wide Web. My website is vindyteja.com. So that's VINDYTEJA.com. And they can link to my book and my TED Talk from the site, or they can, visit online retailers like Amazon or Indigo, and the book is there. And so that's probably the easiest way. I'm on all the regular social media sites as well, but that's all on my website. It's probably the easiest way.
Well, that's awesome. I always talk about women in leadership, and everybody, Vindy, it's a woman in leadership. You're leading the world forward with such important work and your story. One last thing I want to share with you, and then let you have the last word with a question I want you to answer if you can, is there was a study done of 90-year-olds. This is a Canadian study from my research. And they asked them, what was your biggest regret at age 90? And the three top ones were, I didn't risk enough. I didn't leave a big enough legacy. I didn't reflect enough. And so with everything you're doing now and what's next for Vindy, I would think in my mind, when you're done with this world, with what your purpose or passion, whatever however you want to put that, when you're done with this world, what will it look like?
I hope that it will be a warmer, more open-minded place. I mean, I feel like I live outside my comfort zone, and I have for quite some time. And so I haven't done any shortage of reflecting, and so I just really want to sort of share and learn. And I think that being open-minded and curious, if I had to focus on a word, it would be curious. Like if I remain curious and foster that in others, I think there would be a lot less judgment and a lot less conflict and a lot more openness and resolving of issues. And that's my hope.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. I wrote that word down on my list of you, curious, and your daughter's blessed to have a mom who's curious. It's almost childlike when you're curious, and it's actually the path to make better mental health. So that's amazing. Well, everybody, let's just go and thank Vindy. Thank you for being on the show. It's a pleasure. Probably have you back again to talk more about a bunch of stuff.
This was fun. I could go on for a long time with you. This is a great time. Thank you, Tom.
You're welcome. Well, I'll challenge you next time before we do one. We'll call it the wine talk. Have some wine before. Let's just really see what the real answers are.
I know, the truth serum.
The truth. Yeah. Anyway, thank you. And everybody, find Vindy's interview, and if you're on your favorite podcast channel, give it a high rating to honor her work, and find that true passion like you hear from her, and live the life you deserve and desire, and with purpose. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Quiet Warrior Show. Create is a motive-based leadership development firm. www.kreat.ca